We have command line programs for busy developers with Aaron Iles. Aaron is a senior software developer with 10 years of experience who, on any given day, develops or maintains software using Python, C, C++, JavaScript, PHP, Bash, CSS, XML, or XSLT. Python, however, is his preferred environment. As a senior developer with the Australian Government, Aaron is responsible for the delivery of quick reaction capabilities to support new business initiatives and technical leadership and mentoring for staff. Thank you, Aaron.
Hello. Well, this is going to be a very busy presentation, and that's not just because I have a lot of content and I'm quite nervous, but also because somewhere in this room there will be at least one person on Wednesday who's going to sit down and be writing a data analytic. There'll be someone else in this room who will be writing a simple little script to unmess the database because the person sitting next to them wrote a simple little script that messed up the database. These people all have something in common. They're all very, very busy, and unfortunately they're probably too busy to take those very useful little scripts and convert them into command line programs for them future selves or for their colleagues sitting next to them. So my name's Aaron, and I had just this problem. I'd write a lot of useful little tools, but they would have hard-coded values, and I would be the only one that would be able to go in there and reuse them, assuming that I could figure out what I was doing sometime later on. So today's presentation is going to come in two parts, and the objective is to help you solve this problem as well. Part one, I'm going to do a quick survey of a bunch of available tools that I found that can help you solve this problem to easily and quickly take your scripts and convert them into command line applications. In the second part, I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into the tool that I wrote myself and some of my friends use to help solve this problem as well. So let's launch into part one, a survey. Now, if you're going to go about doing this, you should have a bit of a methodological process. And this is the process I used when evaluating the tools that I could come across. I decided I was going to write a small little Twitter client application. It was going to have 3 subcommands to display various lists, retweets, mentions. It would take API tokens either on the command line for the Twitter API, or I could set those API tokens via the environment variables. And this is the review criteria that was important to me. I really was looking for something with a small API, something that I could quickly, easily remember so I wouldn't have to go off and check documentation how to use it again. I'm looking for something that was minimal disruption to my workflow. If I'm working on something and I suddenly decided that I really should make this into a command line application, I really didn't want to have to stop work for 30 minutes while I figured that out. Didn't want much boilerplate code. A lot of these useful scripts are only 10, 20, 30 lines of code. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me if I've got to move past 60 lines of command line programming code. The last part is I'd really like a rich and powerful command line, or as rich and powerful as I could get. Now, to help you go through and review these as well, all the applications that are written or was backed to help look at the command line toolkits that are here are sitting up on my GitHub account under the command line examples code. The slides for this particular presentation are also up on SpeakerDeck if you can't remember that URL. So let's begin. Wonderful thing about Python is it has a fantastic standard library, batteries included. And we're blessed with not 1, not 2, but 3 different ways to process the command line depending on what version of Python you're in. The granddaddy of these is getopt. And getopt is the oldest of the command line parsing tools inside the standard library. It's a very thin wrapper over the C standard library. It's a very simple API, and it's based upon function calls. Getopt has a problem, though. It doesn't have a lot of functionality. In fact, there's almost nothing there at all. This is an example of how to use getopt. You call a function, you pass in the arguments you want parsed, you put in a very simple format string. There's no ability to say these should have default values. There's no ability to say this should be a boolean and this should be an int. There's no ability to automatically generate help output. There's a very minimal amount of control in here. You have to build a lot around this to get a good command line. So later on, Python incorporated optparse. Optparse is a much higher level command line parser. It supports common option behaviors. This is a Boolean flag. This should convert to a specific type. This should set a flag. It's an object-based API, meaning that you instantiate an object and make a bunch of method calls onto it to describe what your command line should look like. Again, unfortunately, optparse has some limitations. It's a pretty verbose API. And if anyone's gone and looked at the standard library docs for this, they're quite long. It's very featureful. It's a very large API. It doesn't support any subcommands. Now, by subcommands, if anyone's used a version control system, SVN, Git, Mercurial, or any tool where you call the application, and then you pass a subcommand like checkout, check-in, stash, pull, fetch, any of those, they're commonly referred to as a subcommand. And the last one is there's no support for positional arguments. I mean, something that's passed in without a particular flag, it's just A, B, or C listed along the command line. So this is an example of using optparse to parse the command line. As you can see, there's a lot of code down here. Very powerful, but a lot of code that needs to be right, and you need to remember what all those keyword arguments are. Later on, argparse was incorporated into the standard library. Again, another high-level command line parser, so a lot of great features in here. Support for common option behaviors, support subcommands this time, so we can actually incorporate in subcommand parsing, and another object-based API. Fortunately, argparse has some issues as well. It's only available in 2.7, although there is a backport on PyPI that you can download for Python 2.6. But it's still a very verbose API and very large API. There's an enormous amount of docs on the standard library docs for this. And for an example, very similar to optparse, a very large amount of code needing to be written to get the command line parsing. So we also have the Python package index, where a lot of wonderful developers go and make their code available for use. And package index has a great array of command line parsers. So I've pulled out some of the ones that I think are the most common. We'll start with Cliff. This is a command line interface framework. It's a framework over the top of argparse. It's really intended to be used with setup tools as entry points. So if anyone's created their own package, setup tools as a package system has a plugin mechanism where you can declare this is the entry point and this is the class or the function that plugs in at that specific name. And it's a class-based API, unlike the previous ones. Unfortunately, fortunately for Cliff, it has many hooks during the application lifecycle. It's available as part of OpenStack and has a great array where developers can plug in and run their own code at different stages of the application starting up and shutting down. Unfortunately, for my purposes, it really doesn't provide any abstraction over argparse. So it requires you to directly use argparse and comes in with all the limitations that I found for argparse personally, being very, very large and verbose. Essentially requires the use of subcommands, really isn't designed to support anything outside of that, and really expects the use of entry points. So much so that here's a very simple example of using Cliff. Class-based, so requires to inherit from the application from the command, and you run it. This sample won't actually run. In order to get this to run from a single command, I had to dig into the privates of the code base itself and use an undocumented feature to make it run within a single script. It's not really what I was after. Docopt. This is a very interesting tool. A lot of very well-respected and very capable developers love Docopt. It's unusual in that it doesn't actually require code to wire up your command line. You describe it in text. You essentially write the help documentation, and Docopt will figure out what your command line is supposed to be like from there. So it's very easy to make quite complex command line logic. In fact, there's command line logic you can get out of Docopt that you can't get out of any of the other command line interface toolkits we'll look at today. Unfortunately, when I went through, things that I found didn't work to meet my needs, multiple points of control. So you pass the command line, it produces arguments out. That needs to pair up with how you've defined your functions. If you want to change the arguments, you need to change it in two places, something that personally irked me. Not to say that Docopt's terrible, which is something that I didn't particularly feel worked for me. I needed to understand a new syntax, which meant that I would constantly forget it, would need to go back to the documentation to look it up, and actually has fewer option behaviors. The nature of it is that while you get very complex logic, you can't do some things as easily. This is a bit of like how it works with Docopt. At the top is what looks very much like help usage, and at the bottom is the parsing of it, and you get the args out. The last PyPI package we'll look at is Click, which is a very recent entry, comes from the same developer behind the Flask web framework. So a very capable developer, very nice toolkit, this one. It's another high-level abstraction, wrapping over optparse this time as a decorator-based API. It's very simple and powerful API, has excellent Unicode support. It's very unlikely to explode on you if you're using Unicode strings. The developer Armin has put a great deal of effort in and understands this problem very, very well. Has multiple points of control, but you'll see in the next slide that that multiple point brings them a lot closer together. So this is what it looks like to use Click, and what I mean by direct decorator-based API. At the top, we're declaring that we've got a command here. Below that, we're declaring the options. And lastly, we find the function definition. You'll see that Count and name are defined not once but twice, once at the decorator level and again at your function. So this leads on to the second part, begins. So begins is my project. It actually falls in the middle there. It's about a year old now. Begins for me was an effort to deal with the fact that I really didn't like being disrupted in workflows. I wanted to write these command lines much, much quicker. So it's a high-level abstraction, this time for argparse. So it doesn't do its own command line parsing. What it does do is makes it more convenient to effectively build up that option parser without you having to worry about it. And again, it's a decorator-based API. It's a small API, or as small as I can find. It uses reflection on the function signature, so you don't need to declare your arguments. It will figure them out for you by looking at the function you're decorating. It uses the inspect module from Python 3, which I've backported to Python 2.7 and 2.6. That's available on PyPI. It replaces the use of _name. I will come back to that in a second. The biggest limitation for begins for me is that it's still in beta. So I use it in production, so my friends use it in production, but there are still areas of the interface that we wish to improve. It needs some enhancements. The documentation still needs a little bit of work. So it's still in beta and there still might be breaking changes. So this is a minimal begins program. We decorate a function. It doesn't do anything. And this is the command line help output. Does nothing. What you don't need to do is this. Begins will take care of this for you. It will inspect the stack when run and will determine whether you're running from the main module or from an entry point and will execute your function for you. Now, we don't call _len and we don't call _get. We don't use any of the other magic methods when we're using protocols. I find this a bit of a weird wart that we still need to do this. And on the rare occasion I need to introduce someone or teach someone new to Python how to create scripts and how to do this well, this always becomes a sort of talking point for them. This is the first time they've exposed to internal magics. So begins provides a protocol for making this disappear. So what are some of the other things that we can do with begins? Start with default values. So this time, our run function takes name, quest, and color, 3 command line arguments, and they come with default values, and accepts a series of positional R's called nights. And now here's the command line output. You can now pass in a name, a quest, and a color as options, and you can pass any number of nights, things on the command line. Name, quest, and color all come with default values. So you can override them if you want, but you don't have to provide them if you don't need to. If you're running on Python 3, Python 3 introduced the idea of annotations into function signatures, objects that describe in some way the function that you're operating on. So in this instance, which is a Python 3 only instance, there's string-based annotations on the name, quest, and color arguments to the function. These will be used to enhance the help output. So here, name, quest, and color have more detailed descriptions based upon those annotations. Boolean flags are special cased. So when begins is inspecting your function signature and it discovers that enable and disable have default values that are Booleans, the command line output, rather than accepting a true or false string, will give you -- enable and -- no-enable, and likewise. Subcommands. So subcommands is, as you mentioned, we saw earlier, was something that Click liked to do. Subcommands are described or documented through the use of the subcommand decorator. These will automatically be gathered across the application as your modules are imported, and will automatically be populated into command lines. So here we've declared 2 subcommands, one's for name and one's for quest. They take an answer each. When we produce the output, there'll be 2 available subcommands listed in the output, name and quest, that were gathered because they were decorated by subcommand. And they each will have their own help output and will each take their own separate set of arguments. The idea here is that you can very quickly and rapidly build up a very powerful, very complex toolkit by using a series of function decompositions and decorators. Let's move on to some more advanced begins. So we just saw subcommands. Sometimes it's convenient to allow people to extend their applications from external locations. We mentioned entry tools earlier that Cliff uses. Well, begins can go look for these entry points as well and load in subcommands from them. So here I've asked begins to add subcommands from the begins plugin demo entry point. And that will go look for that entry point, see what packages have been installed into your Python environment, and load any subcommands that are listed. Sometimes, when you've built a very, very powerful toolkit, you might want to pass multiple subcommands in as a sequence. And so you can optionally declare that there's a delimiter between subcommands. In this case, a very common one is tac-tac. Now, a scenario where this is used a bit more frequently these days is in position of an analysis routine. So we start up, we run subcommand A, which does some form of operation, and then runs subcommand B, which does some other form of operation, possibly passing state between the two of them. You can build together a sequence of these as you describe on your command line a series of actions that need to be performed. Environment variables. If you work in the Unix environment, it's fairly common that you might want to pass in, rather than on the command line, you want to pass in options through the Unix environment. So we can declare a prefix in our decorator that says, I want to be able to set all the options using this prefix. So in this scenario here, I could pass in name and quest with tac-tac name, tac-tac quest. Or, alternatively, I could use the environment and pass mp underscore name, all in uppercase. And that would go through and set the option from the environment. You can still use the command line, it will override. But in this case, if you're working with a platform as a service or another environment, you can optionally set it to come in from your env instead. Similarly, there are configuration file support. So we can declare, I want to go and look for that configuration file. It looks in a number of default locations. And we'll attempt to load options out of the configuration file instead if you would prefer not to use environment variables or command line args. A big one, typecasting. Not every argument you're going to receive is a string. Now, if you don't tell begins what the type's supposed to be, it will simply pass in the string from the command line. So we need to have a mechanism of saying, this is an integer, or this you should pass it through an integer. I want you to make this an integer before you give it to me, otherwise my code will blow up, or my code has to handle it in a special case. So there's a common one for starting the development version of a web application. And I've used begin convert to explicitly say, I want the port argument to be converted using the int, and I want the debug argument to be converted using a utility function called to bool. Begins comes with a small collection of utility classes to do conversions such as to list, to file, to bool. There's another one, there's a couple more as well. That's kind of annoying, because then you have to start explicitly declaring what the casts are going to be. Quite often, though, we're just working with basic types. Strings, integers, floating points. So convert comes with an automatic. So please, it uses the underscore because I want to limit the chance that I'm going to conflict with someone's actual argument name. And here convert will attempt to automatically figure out what the conversions should be for the basic types. You can always combine these, so you can use automatic and then explicitly declare a few more just as overrides if the case may be. All right, we'll keep forging forward. Yet more. One of the things I found I was commonly doing in the command line is constantly doing a sort of same boilerplate, logging. Logging is something I was frequently having to set up, and it'd almost always be the same. I need to set a log level, I need to set a log output file. It's much nicer if I can just drop a decorator on top. Begin logging. This is called an extension decorator. There's a couple already implemented, one for logging and one for the CGI TB or tracebacks module. And this is the command line output. So what it's done is it's taken the parser and automatically added on there command line flags for control of the standard library logging module. It'll also, when you execute it, intercept the call on the way through before it gets to your function and pre-configure the logging module for you. The idea here is, rather than me putting in print statements everywhere and then commenting them out, and then having to remember to go back in and turn them on later on, I can use logging.debug level during development, and then simply let it run at a standard info level later on. If my application or command line application starts crashing or exhibiting weird behavior, all I need to do is change the logging functions later on to suddenly get all that debugging output back. So that's probably enough. You probably had overwhelmed with functionality and features inside of begins. So I'm going to stop for some closing thoughts now on command line applications. You probably already figured out that command line frameworks are essentially the new web framework. Yeah, everyone's got their own, and they're arriving at a rate of one a month at the moment. Possibly not. But I'd like to encourage a bit of pragmatism over ideology. Your application is not its command line toolkit. And I'm not advocating anyone changes the toolkit that they're using right now if they found something successful. What I'd like to advocate is for people to go and find a toolkit that works for them. Find something that they find convenient, find something that doesn't disrupt their flow, find something that they feel comfortable and happy to use. Because it's much more important that we take those scripts and little tools that we write and convert them into those command line applications for our colleagues to use and for ourselves to use further down the track, because we're much more likely to use it that way. So, in closing, good luck. I hope everyone does go forward and finds and starts creating more of these command line applications. I know it's been a definite improvement in our workflow and a definite improvement for some of my colleagues. And I'd like to thank you for coming. It's late on a Sunday, and I do appreciate your attendance. We do have time for questions if anyone would like to come down to the microphones on the other side.
Thanks for that. One defect that I found with some of the other command line parser modules is that they don't handle negative number values very well. They hit the minus sign and treat it as a trigger for an option. Does begins address that?
I believe begins will blow up because argparse doesn't handle that terribly well. You may find that click will support that better. I believe I saw Armin complaining about that. I haven't tested that as a test case. And if I do remember, or you would like to poke an issue at me on Begins' GitHub project, I will investigate support for that, because it definitely is a bit of an issue. But it's not something that's come up for me yet. Any other questions? Don't be shy. If you want to, yeah, we'll try the other.
How about that? There we go.
Yeah.
Looks like a fantastic library. One question though, is there any scope for automatically creating entry points for setup tools from the decorators that you've got? Is there anything like that there so far?
It's never been raised. I'm not sure how I would hook back into. Normally with an entry point, you'd need to declare that on the setup function, and I'm not sure how you would go about pushing that back out. If it's something that's of interest to you, sounds pretty cool. Is there a specific use case for that you can think of?
Just because I'm lazy.
That's as good as up at any.
Yeah, no, normally what I have is might be a whole collection of scripts and stuff like that, and being able to not have to specify those again in setup tools and specify the exact method and stuff like that reduces the my typos and stuff like that might happen.
Definitely sounds like an interesting idea. I'd love to chat to you at morning too if we could a bit further about that, but that sounds very interesting. Thank you.
Hey, really interesting. It looks good. I just wanted to check, is it fully compatible with all of the major operating systems, Unix and Windows?
Possibly. It definitely works pretty well on Unix, mostly Linux, and OS X, which is where I do all my development work. I don't own a Windows machine these days, so it probably works. For the large part, it mostly relies on argparse. So if you have issues with argparse on any particular platform, that's going to affect Begins as well. But if you do know that argparse works on Windows or another platform, VMS or HBX or wherever else you're running, then it Begins should work fine.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I'm not wearing my hat. Frank Sainsbury. I sort of fell asleep halfway through that, so I probably missed something. I'm always a bit concerned when we're splitting off and having another tool. And the other thing that's striking me that, particularly with the command line tool, years ago we had something called choose, which someone down in Tasmania wrote, which allowed you to put in a directory and then just pick things from it. Would that be something that you could use? So you have a directory full of scripts and you have a choose interface and just click on one. And it used to be able to let you fill in the options on the fly and that sort of thing. Quite a useful thing.
I have one of my colleagues has written a nasty piece of code that we'll do something very similar to that. We'll find a directory, go and add it to the system path, ensure that they all get imported, and so any subcommands that are defined dynamically in this location will get added to your command. They use it in their environment to enable developers. They use begins to build a large toolkit for builds, and so they enable their developers to extend that toolkit to add new commands. That's probably the closest thing. I've been looking at bringing that in, and that sounds the closest thing to choose by the sounds of it. So there are people that are starting to have that difficulty where they've got a corporately supported or organizationally level supported work, but it still enabled individual developers to extend it, not necessarily through setup tools, which is currently the only mechanism that it begins supports.
I just have one question. Can it also read configuration file?
So can you repeat that, configuration file?
So for example, you specify -f and then a configuration file, and then can you parse that configuration file?
Right now, no. So the configuration files are limited to declaring the name, and begins will go hunting in the current location, and a couple of the others platform dependent. But right now, there's no mechanism for explicitly saying this is the config file I want you to use. Good point, though. Probably something it should do. Did I mention beta? Thank you.
Okay, one more question. Does it work with CXFreeze, PyTXE, those tools?
Never tried. I don't know if someone would like to try that for me, because it's not something I do on my workflows. If someone would like to try that and get back to me, that'd be fantastic. I think we're done.